It's time for our Friday special interview portion, Zoom In. We pre-recorded this follow-up interview earlier this week to discuss the changes unfolding in Ukraine as the war rages on. Here's Olga Tokariuk, independent Ukrainian journalist.
Now that we're being recorded, if you don't mind, could we start the interview immediately?
Yes. You've seen my email that I'm in the basement, so because we just had an air raid alert. So I'm sorry for the setup.
Oh, no problem at all. We just thank you for joining us and taking time to speak with us again. If you don't mind me asking, the last time we spoke, you were closer to the border of Western Ukraine. Without giving specifics, did you have to actually relocate with the changes that's unfolding in Ukraine?
No, I'm still in Western Ukraine, close to the border. So here it's relatively quiet. We have these air raid alerts from time to time. And now, again, it's early morning here, and about an hour ago, we had a siren. So I had to go to the basement. And I'm speaking to you from the basement now. But generally, Western Ukraine is still safer, although not all of it, because in some parts, in Lviv, for example, the major city in Western Ukraine, there were Russian missile strikes that killed civilians about 2 weeks ago. But in the rest, of the territory of Western Ukraine, it's relatively safe. So I'm staying here for now.
But of course, we're hearing reports of mass graves outside the besieged southeastern port city, no evacuation corridors. These are the headlines that we continue to get. How are people faring on the ground, and what is the situation like in Ukraine elsewhere across the country?
Well, it depends, of course, very much which part of Ukraine are we talking about. Of course, the most affected is still southeastern Ukraine. Some parts of southern Ukraine are currently under Russian occupation, such as Kherson region, and we are hearing stories of, massive human rights abuses there, disappearances, kidnappings, torture, rape, even extrajudicial killings. But it's very difficult to get objective information from territories that are under Russian control, because obviously they do not let any Ukrainian or even independent Western, journalists from credible media to enter the territory. We also know that people are not being allowed to leave those parts of Ukraine that are under Russian occupation in the south. They are planning to conduct a so-called referendum there and declare People's Republic of Kherson, of course, in violation of any principles of international law at the point of a gun. It's possible that it's going to happen even this week. So we will see what happens. But the accounts that we get from people who manage somehow to escape those areas, they are of massive human rights abuses, and also that the Russians are preparing to conduct a mobilization of men there to send them to fight against the Ukrainian army. And this is about southern Ukraine that is under currently Russian occupation, but other parts of the country where the battles are going on, of course, Mariupol, first of all. The city doesn't exist anymore, basically, and up to 20,000 civilians might have been killed there. This is according to the mayor of Mariupol. We know that there are still civilians, dozens and possibly up to 100,000 civilians in Mariupol. Also, there are Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who are trapped in the basements of a huge steel mill and Azovstal plant, and Russia is bombing them with heavy bombs and basically trying to eliminate this last pocket of Ukrainian resistance. But it's still remarkable that for 2 months, these Ukrainian defenders are holding in the city. They are not giving up, and they are actually a source of huge inspiration for the rest of the country because of, their courage and their strength. And other parts of eastern Ukraine are under constant Russian shelling. Kharkiv, second largest city of Ukraine with more than 1 million population, is constantly under Russian bombing. Basically every day civilians die there as a result of these attacks. There are also heavy battles on the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, because Russians are trying to get to grab more territory there, and Ukrainian forces who are present there, who have been present there since 2014 when the war started. So there are some of the best, most experienced Ukrainian units, and they are repelling these attacks. But for civilians, of course, it's very difficult. That's why local authorities, they were calling on people to leave those areas, to evacuate to other safer parts of Ukraine. But many people still remain there. Oh, in fact, even my relatives still stay in Donetsk region. My aunt, she doesn't want to leave, despite all our attempts to persuade her to leave. But it's not even. Sometimes it's not safe to get evacuated because Russians are firing on these evacuation buses, and they hit the train station in Kramatorsk in the Donetsk region from where people, were trying to evacuate. There were thousands of people when they hit it with a missile, and they killed more than 50 people. So when people make this decision, should they leave or should they not, they also factor this risk that even during evacuation, they might be targeted.
So in some cases, it's about not wanting to leave, where home might have been, but also in some cases, it's about finding a safe haven or a safe route to get out, or maybe even the timing of it all. So it does sound like a lot has to go into play for that decision to be made. Actually, talking about the amount of civilian deaths, of course, we're not getting the most accurate or recent numbers, but the sheer amount of images we're getting is hard for us to even keep up with. And in fact, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, expressed anger at the civilian deaths ahead of the first visit by top U.S. diplomats since the invasion began, from what I understand. What are some of the human rights violations you have been seeing on the ground beyond what you've just mentioned already, and especially the heinous ones committed by Russia?
Well, I think the most striking and shocking images of Russian human rights violations and potentially war crimes we've seen in Bucha, in Kyiv region, where after the Russians retreated, were found not just mass graves with people who were buried there, people who were killed by Russians, but also just bodies were lying on the streets because Russians would not allow them, other people to collect them and to bury them. So there've been multiple, confirmations and reports and witnesses who spoke about massive extrajudicial killings when people were shot in the back of their heads while they had their hands tied behind their backs. There were reports of mass rape and gang rape of not just women, but also children, men, and elderly people. This is according to Ukraine's ombudsman. So, some of the most heinous crimes were happening in Bucha. I think all the world has saw those images and were shocked and was terrified at seeing them. But unfortunately, it's not just Bucha. In many other Ukrainian towns and villages, similar things were happening, maybe not on such a huge scale because of the size of those settlements. They were smaller. But for example, in Borodyanka, this is another town near Kyiv, Russians were deliberately destroying residential areas. They were bombing high-rise buildings where people, were hiding in the basements underneath those buildings. But they were unable to get out of those basements because Russians were not allowing rescuers to extract those people, to help them out after the bombing was over, because the town was under occupation. So people were just dying slowly and painfully under the rubble. This is yet again a huge, of course, crime. And there are other reports of other crimes committed by Russian soldiers, such as kidnappings. There are, hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians whose whereabouts are unknown, who went missing after Russian soldiers occupied their, the place where they were living. Some of them might have been killed. Some of them might have been forcibly taken to Russia. This is yet another human rights violation that Russians are committing. They are deporting, illegally taking people against their own will across the border. Sometimes they transit through Belarus, sometimes directly to Russia. And, I partnered with one Ukrainian human rights organization, and we are holding Twitter spaces every week where we invite those people who are testimonies or who, on their own experienced these crimes, survivors, I would say, of the atrocities committed by Russian soldiers. And just last week, we had a woman from Mariupol who was telling us how she and her family was forcibly deported to Russia, and how people, how they had to go through filtration camp where Russians were stripping people naked, like mostly men, but not only, interrogating them for hours, seizing their documents, seizing their mobile phones, holding them captive without, giving any timetable or any indication what they are going to do next. And then they were put on the buses and taken across the borders to Russia. And some of the people were then put on the trains and sent to faraway eastern regions of Russia, the Sakhalin Island and faraway regions close to China, Japan. Multiple instances of different crimes. Thankfully, I know that there have been already some investigators, international investigators working on the ground in Ukraine. I know for France, for sure, there were some, maybe from other countries, who are helping their Ukrainian colleagues to document these war crimes so that one day their perpetrators can be prosecuted and brought to justice.
And to be questioned legitimately on grounds of legitimate war crimes, it seems there needs to be proper documentation for us to charge the Russian troops with these crimes, it seems. And suddenly it makes more sense, the heated remarks that came from President Zelensky calling Russians bloody bastards or even comparing them to Nazis. If you take it into account everything you just mentioned and firsthand testimonies, it does line up. We're now 2 months into the war, Ms. Olga, and with seemingly no end in sight, as you said, Ukrainian forces have stood their ground. Are you witnessing any visible changes?
Do you mean like on the ground or in people's perception in the
maybe
attitude?
Maybe both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to comment on the words of President Zelensky when he called Russians bloody bastards. He was referring to one of the latest crimes that they committed. They killed in Odessa. They killed a baby, a 3-month-old baby, and her mother and her grandmother in their apartment. So, civilian people and this happened one day before Easter, before one of the largest religious holidays, both in Ukraine and in Russia. So he was referring to this, and it's clear that the president, he really feels very emotional, like all of us are when we think about children who were killed by Russians. More than 200 children were killed by Russians in the start of this war, and it's impossible to remain indifferent at this thought, especially I think if one has children, can relate and can imagine something similar happening to your child. You just cannot remain indifferent. Like, it's very, very painful. So I understand his emotions. And then coming back to your question on what has changed. Well, I think there are some, speaking about the battlefield, the events on the battlefield, I think the most important takeaways from this initial 2 months of war is that Russians failed to achieve their initial goals. They failed to take Kyiv in either 2 days or in 2 months. So they retreated. They were not just retreated, they were actually kicked out by Ukrainian forces from Kyiv region and also from other northern parts of Ukraine that they held under their control for about 2 months, Chernihiv and Sumy region. So when we spoke 1 month ago, these territories were still under Russian control. Now they are not anymore. And it's remarkable that already some reconstruction work is beginning there. In Bucha, for example, the people just mobilized and local authorities are coordinating this effort to sweep clean the streets and, to start clearing the debris and the damage. Of course, to rebuild the houses, it will take more time and more effort and more money, definitely. But what people can do already, with their own hands, they are already doing it. It's remarkable. I think it's very significant also, this kind of attitude and spirit of Ukrainians. They want to get back to their normal life as soon as possible. So the first major takeaway is that Russians have been kicked out from northern Ukraine, so they didn't achieve their military objectives there, but they also didn't achieve their objectives in other parts. So like in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, they failed to take Kharkiv. That's why they are shelling it now with the artillery, with the missiles. They are angry at the fact that they were not able to capture the city. They also see the resistance from the local population. They didn't expect such a strong resistance. They thought that at least in eastern Ukraine, people will be welcoming them, or at least not resisting. This didn't happen. Ukrainians are really resisting very harshly in those, huge Russian-speaking cities such as Kharkiv, because the language does not define your loyalty. They might be Russian-speaking, but they want to live in Ukraine, and they are Ukrainian patriots. And another, I think, major takeaway is that Mariupol is still standing. This is huge. Just several thousands of Ukrainian defenders are managing to hold the city, this strategic city, for more than 2 months, and and I think we should not be giving up on them, and efforts should be done to help evacuate those people, to take them out from this steel mill. There should be, I think, an involvement by maybe Pope Francis, by the UN Secretary General, but I think all different routes should be tried to help take those people out. There are so many civilians, children, still in Mariupol. So militarily speaking, this, I think, are three main takeaways: that Russia failed to achieve its objectives, and it's now trying to reformulate its strategy and its approach. But it also shows us that Ukrainian military and Ukrainian people are much stronger than initially thought, both by Russia, but I think also the outside world. Maybe the world overestimated Russia, but it definitely underestimated Ukrainians, and now everything is kind of falling into place.
It certainly does seem like Russia did miscalculate when it comes to the hand and the forces that the Ukrainian forces would show. I don't think that was something that they took it into account. They thought in days that this would be over, not just in Mariupol, but in different cities. And they've been continuously changing strategies. And that in itself is a reflection of how strong the Ukrainian forces are. I think that's undeniable from afar. Just the reports that we're getting, it is overwhelming, as you said. I cut you off. I'm so sorry, Olga.
Yes, sure. I absolutely agree. You're right. The Ukrainians really showed that they are so, resilient. They are really willing to defend their country, to fight for it. And also the structure of the Ukrainian society, it's very decentralized. This is not like a centralized state as Russia. We have president, we have the authorities, but people are also organizing from bottom up, there is very strong this bottom up movement, civil society in Ukraine, and we are seeing it manifested also in this war and this huge resistance effort, also supported by many people who are outside, not on the front line, but also even abroad, Ukrainians who are sending, collecting money, sending help, sending donations, sending, buying vests and helmets and everything for the soldiers, while the help from the outside world is not enough to provide them with that. Buying food, buying medicines, tactical medicine kits, everything. So this huge effort. It was there back in 2014 when the war first started, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. But now it's just multiplied by, many numbers. But it's still there. It's still there. It shows this structure of the society, which is very decentralized and very supportive of some cause and very united in fighting against, the common enemy. And I think the last point,
Ukraine, it seems.
Yeah, independent, definitely, for the survival of the independent Ukraine, for a democratic, free country, because we know that where Russia comes, there is no freedom, there is no democracy, there is no, normal life. And I think the last point in the summing up these 2 months of war is that Russia also miscalculated when it thought that there will be no united response of the world to what is happening in Ukraine. We actually have seen the unity inside NATO and inside, most of the democratic world. to support Ukraine. And countries are also swiftly changing their position on the arms delivery to Ukraine. They are supplying more weapons. Of course, it's still not enough because many of those weapons are just getting used. And, in the very first days, like every week, we need more and more weapons because they are getting destroyed by Russians, not just like looking at them or using them in the battle. So there should be more of that support, but I think Russia didn't expect, this sort of like support coming to Ukraine. And also they didn't expect such strong sanctions, although there's still a lot to be done in terms of sanctions. There should be an oil and gas embargo to cripple Russian economy. But in general, I think it's also one of the major takeaways that, Russians were not able to divide the free world, at least, on the issue of this war, on their assault on Ukraine.
Olga, the last question we want to ask is, South Korea is limited. It has promised to provide humanitarian aid. Is there anything else the South Korean public can engage in and be of help of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, I think, that's what we ask all countries. Please send us more weapons so we can defend ourselves. Ukraine didn't attack anyone. Ukraine didn't go to grab someone else's territory. We are on our land and we are trying to, defend this land to protect millions of lives, because we see that people are not only dying in the battlefield. Russia is killing deliberately so many civilians by its missiles, by its bombs, but also its soldiers. When they grab territory, when they occupy territory, they just go from house to house and they are executing civilians for nothing, for little things, for speaking Ukrainian language, for having the Ukrainian flag, for having a photo that they don't like in the smartphone. So they think that, you're a Nazi or whatever, any sort of lame excuse that they can invent. So we are fighting for the preservation of these millions of lives, for human rights, that they are ensured, that people have access, to freedoms that you have in your country. So we are fighting for democracy, for freedom, for independence. So we are just asking to help us with that. We are not asking anyone to engage in this war on our behalf to defend us, but please give us what we ask for, give us more weapons, and please also cut your ties with Russia to weaken it economically, so it does not have money to finance its war machine, which it uses to kill Ukrainian civilians.
Olga, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I can only imagine so early on today. We hope you stay safe and speak to you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lina.
That was our follow-up interview with Olga Tokariuk. She's an independent Ukrainian journalist. If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.